My guest today is Reverend Canon Nigel Biggar, a historian, theologian, and ethicist, currently serving as Regius Professor Emeritus of Moral Theology at the University of Oxford. Nigel has been described as one of the leading living Western ethicists by the New Statesman and is named as one of Prospect Magazine's top thinkers of 2024. He has published 8 books and has written several articles since the 7th of October Hamas terrorist atrocities. Nigel, thank you very much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks, Eddie. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming. First off, before we dive into your work, focusing on Israel and Hamas, I wanted to ask you more about yourself and your career and how you came to realize that you were meant to be a professor of Christian ethics. Was this always the plan?
No, like most people, Ellie, starting off in life, I didn't know where I was going really, but I wasn't brought up in a religious household. I became a confessing Christian as a teenager, and toward the end of my undergraduate career here in Oxford, where I was studying history in the early 1970s, I was partly really interested in moral questions, but also interested to know why on earth I believe the things I come to believe. So after leaving Oxford, I went to Canada to study Christian theology for a year, which turned into 2 years. And then I ended up at the University of Chicago studying Christian theology, but I discovered ethics there, and I've majored in ethics ever since.
And what is it about ethics that particularly draws you in?
Well, I mean, questions of good and bad, right and wrong are kind of central to human life, aren't they? We all face questions of those kinds, and um, I've long been aware that some of the answers to the questions are quite difficult to find. So I think I've always been interested in them. I think my first love has always been history, and I've read history all my life. And as I say,
Mm.
my first degree was in history. And so when I was reading about, when for the first time I was reading about the First World War and Britain's participation in it, I found myself asking, well, should we have entered the First World War? So those kinds of questions have always interested me. But the humanly, existentially, obviously, really very important to all of us.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, in addition to your academic career, I thought this was very interesting. You've served as a member of one of the Vatican's pontifical academies. I wanted to ask you about that and what that involved and how you found it.
Yeah, so I was a member for 5 years of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and I was one of, I think, 6 appointees who were not Catholic, not Roman Catholic. I'm not Roman Catholic, I'm Anglican. Um, and this was a new initiative by Pope Francis to involve a little bit of diversity in the pontifical academies. So I was, as it were, the sole Protestant in a group of, I think, about 60, as it were, full-time members. And it involved attending a conference in Rome every year. And the topics tended to be bioethical. I think the last one I went to was on artificial intelligence. Um, I'm afraid I didn't feel I was making much contribution, to be honest. So after 5 years of free trips to Rome, which I appreciated enormously, I thought it was only fair to resign, as I didn't think I was doing them much good, although I was enjoying myself.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Now, what I wanted to talk to you about in particular is, as I'm sure you well know, within academic circles, following Hamas's 7th of October terrorist atrocities, there have been some particularly concerning things that have emerged. Almost as soon as the atrocities became known, we saw sickening and widespread celebrations taking place in the streets, on social media, and indeed at some of our leading universities. Within academia, we saw a refusal to condemn Hamas's genocidal acts and a moral confusion takeover. pressure was put on academics to not sign open letters of solidarity for Israeli victims. And we learned from the press that UCU members at Oxford University was set to debate a motion calling for intifada until victory. You've cited in an article how a law lecturer from Kent University posted on her Instagram page the day after the Hamas attacks that, and I quote, resistance by the Palestinian people by all means available is a legitimate act. Now, 2 months later, this lecturer went on to explain on Al Jazeera that everything that is happening now in Israel-Palestine is taking place within the context of colonialization, occupation, and apartheid. Israel is a colonizing power, and the Palestinians are the colonized indigenous population. Nigel, can you tell us about how this narrative surrounding decolonization has been applied to Israel's war against Hamas?
The decolonizing story likes stark shades of black and white, although I guess you can't have a shade of white or black, but it's stark colors of black and white, good and bad, hero and villain. There's not much nuance in the reading of history or their ethics. And so I wasn't entirely surprised. She tweeted, I think, just after the October 7th atrocity, that the Palestinians have every right to use all means available in resisting Israeli oppression. Now, to be fair to her, subsequently, I guess someone warned her what she just said, and she qualified that. But as you say, a while later on Al Jazeera, she, in a sense, explained the hinterland of that comment, because she regards the state of Israel as a classic case of settler colonialism, which is to say, European settlers wade in, they push off native Arabs, and it's simply stealing land from Arabs, and therefore, because of this cartoonish picture of nasty, invasive Zionist settlers versus poor Arab peasant victims, that she was moved to say that she thinks that all means available can be used by the Palestinian victims. But as I explained in one or two things I've written, that story about the origins of the state of Israel is cartoonish, and it doesn't go anywhere near doing justice to the complicated facts.
So, I mean, I'm forced to ask, when you have lecturers like this espousing views like these, what impact do you think that could have on Jewish students in Britain today?
Well, I mean, obviously, and I know that Jewish students and indeed Jewish professors were deeply dismayed and upset at this kind of language, and certainly, I suspect the actual numbers of students and professors lining up behind pro-Palestinian protests and camps, the numbers are probably small, but they make a lot of noise, and they give the impression of being dominant, especially when, as is often the case in these situations, the majority of students and professors stay silent. So I imagine Jewish students and colleagues were quite as upset by the silence of a lot of their colleagues as they were about the noise from the pro-Palestinians. There was as you know, copying developments in the United States. We in Britain developed a minor rash of pro-Palestinian encampments on our campuses, and shortly after that went up, an open letter was published, signed by several hundred. Last time I looked, it was about 400 Oxford academic staff and administrative staff supporting the student protesters. And among the staff was the guy who is director of, I think, equality, diversity, and inclusion in the university. and I and three other colleagues, they were all in fact at least ethnically Jewish, wrote to the Times newspaper to protest and said that we think that senior academic staff representing the whole university, which is in fact intellectually, politically diverse, need to be strictly neutral, because otherwise, this EDI director, I mean, how can Jewish students or colleagues trust his even-handedness when dealing with them as Jews? Um, so I do think, of course, academics themselves have always been opinionated, but particularly administrative staff, managerial staff representing the whole university need to be strictly neutral because they represent everybody, not just a particular point of view.
Right. And on these encampments where senior staff have expressed their support, where do you draw the line between that the valid right to protest and express one's views, and then on the other side of that, intimidation of not just Jewish students but other students who may be trying to go about their life, walk on the campus, and who are finding these encampments seriously concerning?
Yes, well, I've been dismayed at the way in which the law seems to be being interpreted, perhaps by the police and certainly by university authorities, who seem to think that aggressive protesting that does have an intimidating impact and is bound to have it and is intended to have. I mean, oftentimes protesting takes the form of attempts to shout speaking events down, to make so much noise they have to close it down. This is not simply registering your point of view; it is actively trying to repress views you don't like. And authorities, whether police authorities or university authorities, don't seem to recognise that. So in my view, they permit much more than they should, and they do not protect those who dissent from the views being shouted nearly strongly enough, in my view.
Mm. What do you think needs to be done about these encampments?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening at the moment, Ellie. I passed by one of the encampments outside the Redcliffe and Camera this afternoon, and that's gone. Although the damage to the grass will take probably a year to repair. Um, I had heard that, I mean, the protesting students occupied part of the examination schools during exams, and I met one student who'd had his exams disrupted by them, and he told me that the university was had said to somebody that they hoped to have the students out by October, which is to say by the beginning of next academic year, and that struck me as crazy. I mean, I guess the strategy might be that in due course the students will get bored and go home, which is probably true. But I find that response disappointing because I think, going back to my earlier point, there comes a line where you're crossing from protesting to being disruptive and in some cases repressive, and the university ought to take a more robust stand on that. So I don't know where things are in terms of removing students. I saw one campus, as I say, has been dismantled. Others might be in the process of going away too. I don't know.
Yeah, there just seems to be, from an outsider's perspective, a bizarre need from the staff at the university to pacify the protesters rather than actually deal with them. And it just, I think, makes a lot of people lose faith in the universities themselves.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I did ask someone what's going on in the university's head, and I don't know if it's true, but he said the university were worried about. We have a democratic forum here called Congregation, and he said the university was worried about this would be senior members protesting if they used any kind of physical applied any kind of physical pressure to vacate these places. But again, I don't see why the university should be so scared of that. Because I mentioned this open letter signed by several hundred staff. I don't know what the total was in the end. As I say, last time I looked, it was about 400 or so. Maybe it's 600, which looks impressive until you register that there are in Oxford University about 2,000 teaching staff
Mm.
and a lot more administrative staff. So actually, a handful of hundred is a small minority, and I don't see why the
Yeah.
university should be worried about that.
Mm. It's it's interesting because we have seen now how both academic and student activists alike rely on silencing tactics, for example, by threatening and intimidating Jewish or Israeli speakers or students. But at the same time, these are the same people who claim to be concerned with their rights to free speech when they want to express something that is commonly understood to be anti-Semitic. For example, calls for intifada or from the river to the sea chant. How does one make sense of this paradox of shutting down free speech they don't like, and also talking about free speech to protect their right to spew anti-Semitism?
Yes, I mean, um, the the interpretation of the law here is a tricky one. In a liberal society, one does have to allow quite a lot of latitude for people to say things that we regard as obnoxious. We have laws in the country against incitement to racial hatred. Um, Anti-Semitism, I guess, would be a species of that. Um, and so, yeah, chants from the river to the sea. Of course, um, you and I know what that means, but there were people interviewed on television who were chanting it, who, upon being asked which river, which sea, hadn't a clue what they were chanting.
Mm,
So a lot of people are doing it mindlessly. But Hamas knows what it means. It can only mean the expulsion of the Jewish people, certainly the dismantling of the Jewish state, of the state of Israel, and with the dismantling of the state, what on earth is going to happen to the 9 million Jews in it? Um, so, but again, I guess I'm sympathise with your position. I think, Ellie, that authorities are far too indulgent of those who um, cross the line, and far too indulgent of their power to intimidate other people into silence.
mm,
They don't seem to recognize the extent to which their indulgence of the noisy, aggressive zealots spreads. It has a chilling effect. It makes other people think twice before they open their mouths because they're scared of attracting that kind of aggro. And by the way, they notice how the university authorities do not uh, uh, indulge the aggressive people and often do not support those who are
mm.
intimidated by them. Um,
Yeah, I think one thing that you said that particularly stands out is you pinpointed the mindless parroting of these chants and slogans. I think a lot of people at these protests don't even consider whether they're speaking fact or fiction. So, for example, Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, we have gone out to several of the large London anti-Israel demonstrations. We have interviewed people there. We have asked them various questions. One of the questions we ask is, do you think Hamas is anti-Semitic? And you would be, I'm not sure anyone said yes. I think we have had, it's almost universally been no, of course they can't be. And I think it's fascinating. And I want your opinion on this. Why do you think we are now seeing this apparent marriage of far left ideology and Islamist ideology in the way that we haven't really seen before, in a way that is also creeping into our university campuses?
well, it's a great irony there, isn't it? Yes, the marrying of the far left with Islamism. Yeah, someone pointed out to bring that to a point. Someone pointed out to me that some people have been waving banners written across them, "Queers for Palestine" or "Queers for Gaza," not having noticed that Hamas and that form of Islam takes a rather dim view of homosexual practice. So what's happening here? Well, on the one hand, just to go back to the what it is about the left that has made it so anti-Israel, it is partly the the cartoonish, decolonizing, um, colonial settler narrative. As to how they've come to, I mean, I guess the alliance with Islamism is simply that Hamas is a group of freedom fighters, is it not? And that's enough. It doesn't matter that they're constitutionally anti-Semitic. Doesn't matter that they're constitutionally genocidal in their commitment to eradicate the state of Israel. It doesn't matter what methods they use. Apparently, that doesn't matter.
It's also incredibly concerning that in this country and many other countries, Hamas is a designated terrorist organization, and showing support for them can very well lead to jail time. So the fact that, despite that, anti-Israel protesters are still very willing to espouse support for them is really concerning. And that leads me on to my next question. Although you answered a great deal of it in your previous answer, but I must ask, why of all of the countries and all of the regions in the world within academia, why is Israel the main obsession more than any other place?
I suspect the answer does lie in what I've said before, Ellie, that Israel is a kind of epitome of the invasive, colonizing, oppressive West. Um, and yeah, I think that really sums it up. I can't think of any other reason why the obsession with Israel. I mean, unless I mean, I guess anti-Semitism has its own, as it were, intrinsic attractions to certain people. Um, and so there may well be, quite apart from the anti-Western theme, there may be some purely anti-Semitic threads there too.
Yeah, I think that's some pretty good sense. Nigel, let me ask you a question now that I ask all of our guests, which is if someone approaches you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
Um, well, if it's a uh, ordinary person, I guess the general advice is um, we've got to have the courage to call these things out. Don't stay silent. And this applies to a number of issues across the board, where people are intimidated. Um, um, they don't say what they think. They don't protest because they're worried what people will think of them. They're worried about losing friends. Um, um, they don't want to attract aggression. But folks, we've got to take that risk. And if you do take that risk, I'm addressing one of the people you think you're presenting to me. Um, I think we'll discover actually many more people around us will start to support us, because what happens, I think, is that you get the noisy, zealous minority who are shouting and clamoring. You get the majority who are not sure, don't know enough to contradict what's being said, don't like it, um, but they look around and no one else is saying anything, so they assume they're the only one in the room who dissents. But they're not,
Mm,
they're majority. But unless you speak out, no one knows. So someone
mm.
has to take the risk of doing that. That would be my general advice.
It's not an easy thing to do, but when you do speak out, it's incredibly worthwhile. And I don't think many would regret it if they feel like they're speaking out for the right thing.
Yeah.
Nigel, as we begin to wrap up now, I want to ask you, what have you got going on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you?
Right. So what am I up to? Well, I published this book on colonialism and moral reckoning last year. The paperback with a bright new shiny postscript came out in March. I'm still living off that. I'm talking all over the place about it. I'm going to Australia in the autumn on a speaking tour about it, and then Canada in next year. So I'm still propagating that, because I think the decolonizing narrative that I spoke about earlier is, apart from being untrue, is politically toxic, and we need to call it out. My next project, I just signed a contract to write a short book under the title Intellectual Vice. And this is going to be about universities and the culture wars. And it's going to culminate in a demonstration of instances of intellectual vices that senior professors in major universities have displayed, particularly on the issue of anti-colonialism. And these are vices that they will communicate to their students, who then become journalists and politicians, and begin to repeat all the intellectual mistakes of their professors. So they don't listen, they distort what they hear. Instead of attacking an argument, they attack the person. They set up straw men. They concede nothing. And what happens in the university classroom then goes out to poison public discourse. So I will write a book about that, and the last chapter will be explaining the virtues, the intellectual virtues that universities have a civic duty to propagate if we want to keep a liberal society. You'll find my my webpage on the Faculty of Theology website at the University of Oxford. So Google Biggar Theology Oxford will come up. I'm also on Twitter, and I have a personal website which is Nigel Biggar. That's BIGGAR .uk/. But if you type in my name, you'll discover my website, which I try and populate the website with everything I've written, or just about everything I've written, just so people can see it all there in one place. So feel free to find out where I live. Well, online.
Yes, yeah, definitely not in real life. Nigel, thank you very much for coming on Podcast Against Anti-Semitism.
My pleasure, Ellie. Thanks for inviting me.